Welcome back to Careers Explained. Today we're talking with Tomás Husted about his career path and current role. After getting his bachelor's degree from Davidson College, he worked as a research associate for the Congressional Research Service and as a strategy and development fellow for the International Rescue Committee. He's currently an analyst in African Affairs for the Congressional Research Service. Welcome, Tomás, and thanks for coming on today.
Thank you so much.
Can you start by telling us your original career interest, maybe going back to college?
Entering college, I had, I think, an interest in international relations, international affairs, but more focused on Latin America. So my mother is from Latin America, from Uruguay, and growing up, we would speak Spanish in the house, and I think I was kind of drawn to Latin American studies. With a focus on U.S. policy as well. So kind of focused on the U.S. foreign affairs in Latin America. Over time, I began to become particularly interested in human rights issues, and that functional focus on human rights, that sort of, I guess, kind of sectoral focus, kind of reoriented me toward African affairs. And so when I was still in college, I did an internship at the Enough Project, which is a human rights organization that is part of the Center for American Progress, which is a large think tank and advocacy group in advocacy organization in Washington. I'm not exactly sure like how the administrative kind of umbrella works there, but Enough Project is a human rights group that focuses on Central Africa, and it's part of the Center for American Progress. And I did an internship there on their Democratic Republic of Congo policy team. And that was really my first kind of specific focus on Africa. And that kind of, I think, really encouraged me into the field. And from that internship into, kind of an academic focus on in this case Central Africa, which is what I wrote my my big capstone paper for him, and then that kind of propelled me, I think, into down the African affairs route.
And so when you figured out what you wanted to do, senior year comes around, can you walk through kind of how you selected to work as a research associate?
Right. Yeah. Right. Entering senior year, I think I was not alone in being very anxious about, the future. I developed a sort of sleep issue. Like I became an insomniac. Like I did the career search the worst way possible, which is just like fret about it and lose sleep, like literally lose sleep. So, right, battled insomnia. No, but
Step one,
right,
get sleep, maybe.
Exactly. My good friend of my father's, they were roommates in grad school. He at the time was at the Congressional Research Service, where I now am. And to be honest, I had never heard of CRS, which we can talk a little bit about when we start talking about my current role. CRS, the Congressional Research Service, or CRS, not to be confused with Catholic Relief Services, which is a humanitarian organization. There's a big CRS acronym beef, which we can talk about on another podcast. But so at the Congressional Research Service, it's sort of an if you know thing. Congressional staff know about CRS. A lot of the think tank community in Washington know about CRS. Yeah, I mean, just through the research that we put out, and obviously we track their research and just kind of collegial exchange. Outside of Washington, I think CRS is much less well known, and certainly at Davidson College, getting 3 hours of sleep a night, I was not really super aware of CRS, but I ended up hearing about it through, again, this family contact, and he put me in contact with the African Affairs team at CRS. We can talk a little bit more about kind of how that team is structured, but in short, I reached out to them. There was an internship program for the like a summer internship. I applied for it and ended up getting the internship. And then after that, that was right at the tail end of senior year. And I've kind of been with CRS, I was in a series of basically internships or short-term positions until then coming back. And we can talk about the post-grad trajectory, but coming back now full time since 2018. So.
And it looks like on that path, you started at CRS and then maybe did a year at the International Rescue Committee. Can you talk about how those were related, or if they're not related, what made you leave when you did?
Right. Yeah. So taking your second question first, what made you leave? In international affairs, I would say, I cannot stress highly enough the importance of, some people call it field work. I think that, I don't know, field work to me represents a very specific, you're doing research in, like abroad in a particular
Boots on the
thing.
ground.
But I just mean living abroad. Like living abroad is important, and especially like living in the region that you are, working on. And so certain regions, that said, are easier to move to than others, or to find work in, right? I mean, I think Latin America, Europe may be a bit easier than other regions. There is a program called the Princeton in Africa program, and so anyone who's interested in African affairs, I really encourage you to look up this program. Princeton in Africa, or PIAF, is an organization that each year places several dozen recent graduates, kind of in that, recently graduated up till, around 24, 25 age range, places you for a year at an organization or I think in some cases there's some companies as well, places you at an organization that is in Africa. There's a very rigorous process for how you get placed. And so it includes, you sort of talk about your strengths, you talk about your interests, and then the Princeton in Africa sort of is able to filter through their partner organizations and try to find you a good match. So I applied for humanitarian kind of grant writing positions. That I kind of checked that as something that was interesting to me, something I might be able to maybe apply some of my Davidson, writing. Writing is really obviously an emphasis of Davidson, and I thought I could maybe do well in that role. And they paired me with the International Rescue Committee's office in Freetown, Sierra Leone. Each position in Princeton, Africa, it's a 1-year post. Several of my cohort mates ended up, staying on extra time, or, after that, kind of continuing to bounce around sub-Saharan Africa. But that, you are with Princeton, Africa for 1 year. And so I did 1 year from July 2017 to July 2018. It was I think I had I'm just immensely grateful for that opportunity. And I think it was also, formative for my career as an African affairs analyst. Just having time to live and work in the region that you are covering, I think it's again immensely important. And as as a job applicant, I think it's also important for your resume, right? To be able to say that you have this experience.
Definitely. And so you had your 1 year at CRS after graduation, then went to get the actual boots on the ground experience and to come back to CRS. So can you talk about how that 1 year fellowship influenced what you do now, and kind of how that has shaped your view on your career track?
Yeah. So Sierra Leone, for various historical reasons, this is just a little bit background. was a case study in a lot of work research, at the turn of the century related to conflict in sub-Saharan Africa, violent armed conflict. There was a civil war in the late 90s into early 2000s in Sierra Leone, and Sierra Leone then became the subject of a lot of research, of commentary that remains, a lot of it remains relevant today. It kind of forms this like core of conflict studies as it relates to sub-Saharan Africa. I bring that up to just note that for me as an analyst, I think it was formative, not just having this experience living there and seeing politics as it plays out, or seeing government service provision as it plays out in Sierra Leone, right? But I was also able to like really, really explore this body of research while living in Sierra Leone, like 20 years after a lot of it was written, or 15 years after a lot of it was written. And so for me, I think it was like a fascinating, just a fascinating introduction to this field. I also got really interested in sort of like the history of Sierra Leone and of, kind of the coastal West African sub-region in general, and just was like devouring books while I was there. During that time, the Congressional Research Service had a position open up actually to cover essentially coastal West and Central Africa, which is the position that I ended up applying for and was fortunate to get selected. And so my current portfolio is essentially, if you're looking at the map of Africa, from kind of the westernmost point, along through Sierra Leone, actually down the coast to the Republic of Congo, just kind of following the Gulf of Guinea coastline there. And so, having lived in that, in one of these countries, and then being able to like, while living there, kind of explore a broader literature, I think as an analyst, I mean, there's really, that's as good as it gets. Yeah.
And now can you talk about what you do as an analyst working in that specific region?
Sure. So I think it might be helpful to talk a little bit about CRS and by extension, talk a little bit about how Congress
That'd be great.
Works in foreign policy. So the Congressional Research Service is it's part of the legislative branch. It's part of the Library of Congress. And it is a nonpartisan, strives to be objective, and strives to be authoritative research service for the US Congress. So we serve all members, all staff, all committees of Congress can call on us, literally. They can send an email, but they can also dial us up and ask for information on essentially any topic, right? Any issue that comes before the Congress. Hopefully there is a CRS analyst to cover it. So this is everything from, I cover coastal West and Central Africa. I'm in a foreign affairs team where we have regional experts and functional experts who cover, essentially all these topics globally. But we also have a government and finance division that covers taxation and government process. We have a domestic social policy division that's working on domestic policy issues here in the United States. We have essentially all of these analysts and research librarians who are on call for the Congress whenever there's a need for information to inform the legislative process, and to inform basically Congress's day-to-day activity. What that looks like for me, I think we have to just think about how Congress engages in foreign policy. A lot of, I think, when we talk about foreign policy, we think about like the president doing something or the Secretary of State doing something. But Congress has a defined role in foreign policy, and engages in various ways when it comes to foreign affairs or just international relations with the United States. And so my job is essentially to support members and staff in their prerogatives of, overseeing U.S. policy, of appropriating funding for, foreign affairs, for, foreign assistance, and what have you. A lot of my work revolves around the foreign aid appropriations process, where Congress appropriates money for foreign assistance. So not only do I cover the coastal West and Central African subregions, but I also am the lead analyst on U.S. assistance for Africa. So I coordinate this annual report that we do on like U.S. aid funding for African countries. And then, just otherwise providing reports, memoranda, telephone consultations, email responses to, generally speaking, staff on, various issues in that subregion that might come up for them. Maybe they have a constituent from Nigeria who's asking about U.S. policy toward Nigeria, and I can then provide them with information. Here's the situation, that is going on. Or they want to introduce or consider a resolution on an issue in sub-Saharan Africa in my region. So then I would, provide them with information or review their legislation and point out maybe some things that they might consider as their. So it's really it's a legislative information service. We are trying to support Congress to engage in foreign policy.
So on-call researcher for a specific area and issues that would come up in your region of Africa.
Right.
And you mentioned there some examples of questions, which is super helpful, that you might be called on to answer. I'm wondering if you could walk us through kind of the steps of an example question or project you're asked to do research for, and how you typically go about fulfilling that, including kind of how long that process usually takes.
Right. Yeah, it's a great question. I would note up front that I think one of the values of CRS for Congress is that we are a confidential information service, and confidentiality is really it's of utmost importance in our work. And so I understand you're just asking for like a sample, and I'm happy to provide you with happy to give you like an example of what a question might look like. But I just thought it was important to note, and for people who are interested in the work of CRS, I think it's in fact like it's a fascinating and, again, kind of critically important part of our job is that whatever a staffer or a member of Congress says to me or asks of me, any conversations that I have with them are strictly confidential, and I cannot disclose any of that information to anyone else in Congress. So I cannot, if I get a question from a staffer and they say, did this person across the hall ask you for this? I respond, I'm not able to say, I cannot disclose with you any information about conversations that I've had with other staffers or members. And so all to say that that's just a note that I think it's one thing that I think makes CRS very appealing for staff is that we are there's a confidentiality mandate that we are very strict about. And so when it comes to a sample question that I might get, maybe we can look at two different types of questions. Number one would be like the what is going on question. I cover a number of countries that, generally speaking, are not on the radar of US policymakers, including members of Congress. So to put it more humorously, a lot of my memos start with X is a country in West Africa, right? So we're getting, it's basic, I'm not laughing at anyone there. I mean, oftentimes there's no real reason why it would be on the congressional agenda, right? I mean, it's it could be a small country that is we do not provide a lot of foreign aid to. There's no good reason why a member or a staffer would be like intimately familiar with this country. So I bring that up to say that, one kind of big chunk of questions that I get is really focused on like, can you bring me up to speed? I saw something happen. There was a Washington Post article about protests in Sierra Leone, let's say. Can you tell me why these protests are coming up? Are there any issues that we should be concerned about? Are there any concerns about human rights abuses? Are there any concerns about journalists being detained, right? Are there any like big issues that I need to keep in mind as I'm watching this and as I'm briefing my boss, this member of Congress? So that's kind of one general chunk, right? It's just what's going on in the region. The other chunk is, really focused on, what is the United States doing in X region, right? So I mentioned foreign assistance being, a critical part of my portfolio. A lot of the questions I get are, generally relate to what kind of assistance are we providing to this country? How much assistance do we give them each year? What are the focus areas of that assistance? Again, are there any like things that I should be aware of as I'm conducting oversight of, U.S. foreign assistance for X country? And so that's really kind of it's the U.S. angle that I think is the other big focus area. And of course, there's like tons of, permutations of this, right? I cover about 13 or 14 countries. And so, it could be a very narrow question on like one particular, issue in a country, or it could be kind of a general like trend of, can we talk about the rising extremist violence in this general region that I cover? Okay, happy to provide you with, as much or as little information as you'd like on that issue.
And then when you get, if it varies by the type of question, if you could break that down, but let's start with this sort of what's going on here question about a specific region or country. What are the steps and what's the typical timeline to get back to them the information requested?
Yeah, there's right. A lot of my role, a lot of the role of CRS in general is negotiating with clients, and not just kind of negotiating for more time, but being very upfront and very clear about, what they need by when they need it and what we can provide on that timeline. The world of the congressional staffer it's fast paced. It is oftentimes like very intense, and it's oftentimes, I think there is some bit of navel gazing, or there's this CRS talking shop about some we got this request for a 15-page memo and they want it by tomorrow. Isn't that crazy? Well, this staffer is being asked for something that is like probably more crazy, right? They were asked for like a 30-page thing by like right. So I think it is a matter of just like being honest and open with staff. One of the joys of my work is that I get to really get to know staff. Many of the staff that I work with, some are just a one-off request. I might get a request from a staffer in a personal office, and they might say something like, we have a constituent from Cameroon, and they asked about, U.S. policy toward Cameroon. Can you give me a little bit of information that I could provide for them? That's basically the extent of the request. I also work with committee staff, generally on the House Foreign Affairs Committee and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, who are Africa experts who have been working on these things for years, sometimes decades. And I have an extensive relationship with them where, they can ask me kind of more informally. They can say, what can you give me on this turnaround? And I can just say, hey, I can get you, this is what I can provide for you. And we have like a working relationship like that is less formal and perhaps like more, there's more background that we can kind of build on. So all to say that the process, if we get a question like that, I think number one, and this should go without saying, but I think like this is advice that I would give to everyone who is entering the job market. You say that you got their email, because like people don't like sending a request and then just twiddling their thumbs, So number one, you just say, hey, receive your email. I'm going to talk to the team. We'll see what we can provide you. Do you have a deadline for this information, right? They will provide us, with a deadline, and then we will tell them what we can provide on that deadline. There's like a joking thing, which of course, like my boss would not approve of me saying, but the CRS, again, joke is, if you want it bad, you get it bad, right? Like if you wait to request something at the very last minute, there's only so much we can provide you with, on that timeline. So in an ideal case, right, we have like a couple weeks to craft a memo or, whatever it is, and to bring in as many people as we need to bring in. And this is, I think, a good introduction to what I find to be the most wonderful part of working at CRS, which is the review process. And so whenever I write, a memo or a report, it's not just like, Heidi asked for this, I'm just gonna like go off vibes, I'm just gonna write whatever I want and send it back. Everything that I write goes through a review process that varies a bit in terms of how extensive it is based on like the length of the product, or the timeline. But ultimately, like whatever I'm writing ends up getting reviewed by colleagues who cover Africa, by colleagues who don't cover Africa, cover other things that might be involved in the response, by my boss who oversees the Middle East and Africa teams, by her boss who covers all foreign affairs issues. And so there's an extensive review process that reviews not only for accuracy, but also for adherence to CRS guidelines. Perhaps the most important being objectivity. So there's no, our work is not to give opinions, it is to present the facts and the congressional options as we see them. And so everything I write is there's a lengthy review process that adds time. The reason I bring this up is that, when I am budgeting time for a project, I'm factoring in that it will spend, perhaps 2 to 3 days, perhaps longer, being reviewed, which is just a great process that ultimately makes the products better, but is, an important thing to consider when I'm thinking about a project.
That's fascinating to hear about the review process and to get a sense of, on average, maybe a 2-week turnaround for you to gather the information and then get it through that review. And I'm curious what it looks like in terms of the requests you get. Obviously, anyone, you mentioned staffers or members, can ask. How many requests are you typically receiving on a given day or week? How many projects are you working on simultaneously?
Yeah, so I mean, kind of linked to the fact that the countries that I cover, many of them are not, typically priority countries when it comes to U.S. foreign policy. A lot of my work is not request driven. A lot of it is, working on larger products or, kind of these standing reports that we prepare so that staff have them when they want them. We refer to these as like standing reports, or, our publicly accessible products. A lot of my work is focused on producing and maintaining country reports on the big countries in my portfolio, namely Nigeria, Cameroon, Ghana, Liberia. Also putting out and maintaining 2 big regional reports that we do. So I coordinate one which is on US engagement in sub-Saharan Africa, broadly speaking, and one is specifically on foreign aid. And those are, between 20 and 30 pages. And, we just kind of keep those updated every year. hopefully every year. But I have colleagues who, let's say, work on China or work on, defense appropriations, right? And they are getting requests every day. They might get, 2 to 3 requests, because, they have staffers and members who are at that moment engaged in some, they're tracking something that is happening, or they are writing or considering legislation, or they are considering amendments to legislation that involve, these kind of bigger, high profile, higher priority issues. And so for them, a lot of their work day to day is, they've received an email overnight from some staffer and they need to respond directly to that email. My portfolio is really on the other end of the spectrum, where a lot of my work is not driven by requests, but is driven instead by trying to maintain a suite of products, of like backgrounders that, of interest, that on topics of interest to Congress.
So it very much depends on your region, topic, and circumstances of whether or not they might be in the news or being discussed in Congress at that moment in terms of requests and what you're working on. Can you now talk about the things you like most about the job and what's challenging?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think I've like hinted at it. For me, the biggest benefit is working with my colleagues and just being part of a team. In particular, the Africa team. I like, these are people that I started working with when I was 21, when I was fresh out of Davidson. They are brilliant, and they are like it's people that they challenge me and they like hold me to a high standard. And really, I mean, I just really cannot capture like how grateful I have been to work with these folks, because they are, I think, some of the best when it comes to just foreign policy analysts who are trying to just do great work. And yeah, so I think that's the biggest plus for me. The biggest challenge, I think, is or the biggest challenge for me at CRS has been learning the pace and the drivers of congressional activity. From being in Dr. Menkhaus's class to then, I think, doing studies in African affairs at George Washington, where I went for my master's. It's very focused on sub-Saharan Africa. So like, let's look at this particular issue or crisis or challenge or history in sub-Saharan Africa. And it's I love, like, that was an amazing master's program for me. I really enjoyed it. At the same time, my job at CRS is specifically, why does this matter to Congress? And how does this relate to my job as a staffer, right? And for me, like, a lot of that had to be backfilled, where like I had, not expert level, but I had, some regional knowledge from my academic studies and from living in Sierra Leone for a year, and I'm doing this like out, this reading on my own. But the CRS, the value add is take all that and make it make sense to a staffer or to a member of Congress, and make the congressional hook clear. Like, why does it matter? And so learning the congressional process, learning congressional interests and prerogatives, that has been the big issue, where not only am I expected to be an analyst of African affairs, I'm also expected to be an analyst of US congressional affairs, right? And US foreign policy, and the levers and the mechanisms of how Congress engages with international affairs. And so a lot of that has been kind of learning on the fly, learning from colleagues through the review process, where they would say, this is good background on Nigeria. On your US relations, section, you might want to mention this policy or, this resolution or this bill, which affects, the broader story here. So that has been, I think, the biggest challenge. And it is day to day. I find myself still learning every single day from colleagues. So.
Being an expert in the subject matter of both the territories that you're covering, but also the US, and tying them together and answering, so what do I need to know and why?
Yeah.
And so now someone's listening to this and thinking that your job sounds incredible, which it does. And what advice would you give for someone who wants to get a job working at somewhere like CRS, and then how they could succeed in that job?
Yeah, so this is a great question, because I have kind of come up with a list of 10. And so my first piece of advice, which is not on this list, but like if you're gonna have a list, it should be 3 or 5 or 10. Make it a good, sexy number like that. And we'll get a bit into briefing. I think some of my my points are on briefing here. But so the broad context for this list is that I think a lot of times I will get questions of essentially like, how do I get a job at CRS, or how do I do something similar to what you're doing? And a lot of the advice I found very frustrating when I've talked to people, or when I was, searching for a job. A lot of it is like, be a good writer, which is not a measurable thing. It's not necessarily good advice. It's important. It's like an intangible, right? But so I tried to kind of think of some. I thought of big 3 takeaways, and then maybe like 7 hopefully applicable like notes that if there's anything to take away, it's like my big advice for job seekers or for people who are starting out in their careers. So the top 3 kind of big takeaways for me: number 1 is that careers in foreign affairs are oftentimes very frustrating, and they can be very personally challenging, because you're working on countries, like in my portfolio, you're working on countries that you find particularly important. You think the issues the issues there deserve attention from everyone. You think President Biden should be personally focused on this issue. But, it could be that the issues that you work on are not going to be on the congressional agenda. Or it could be that the issues are so big and so important that there's just big gears turning, right? And so I think of colleagues who have worked on, issues related to the Middle East, and where, as much as they can be trying to provide analysis to inform humane and smart foreign policy, there might be these bigger gears that end up kind of, I think it's very hard to turn the ship of US foreign policy on some of these bigger issues. So in that sense, I think you just expect burnout and plan to manage burnout, because burned out analysis is bad analysis. And if you become like, this kind of brooding person in your late 20s, it's a bad look, and your work is going to be bad. So just like get a hobby or get a cat. Like there's things I do both of those things. I have a cat and I have a hobby. So, that's like number 1. Number 2, I think, and I think this has hopefully come through when I've talked about the review process and learning from our colleagues, really, at an early stage in your career, I think the priority should be, or at least was for me, surrounding yourself with people that you respect, that you admire, that challenge you, and to set an example for you in whatever it is. So for me, it was like analysis. Like I tried to surround myself with people who I looked at and I was like, that is good analytical work. Because these are, it ends up, you become used to this intellectual integrity, and you hold yourself to that standard that you learn from others. And then the third is just like as general as I'll get, and it's just to kind of like be childlike. And I don't mean childish. That's very different. You should not be that. What you should be, though, is like, I think you should, when it comes to foreign affairs, a lot of policy work makes things more complicated than they really are. And I think, a lot of the human rights principles and a lot of just like the general humanitarian principles that brought me into this field have never failed me when it comes to like thinking through a policy. Like ultimately, it could be bad or good, right? We don't have to like sit here and, oh, well, kind of be very like liberal artsy about it. Like ultimately, policy is, foreign policy has real impacts. And I think we should be very clear-headed or clear-eyed and level-headed about how we evaluate policy. And for me, that's just being childlike, because kids look at something and they can say that's bad and that's good, in a way that, like, once you're an adult, you're like, well, if we consider, but it's just, I think having that, like, moral clarity and moral certainty, I think is it's very important. So then my 7, now we're down to 7. These will be quicker and I hope more applicable.
Awesome. So
yeah. Okay.
Thank
you. First one, overall, I'm going to do some on writing and some on briefing, which I think for me are the biggest, I've really had to learn how to do that for Congress and for, the DC policy community. But first, overall, applying to both writing and briefing, relates to structure, and that is 3 principles. Number 1, know your customer, KYC. You need to know who you're writing or who you're briefing, who you're writing for or who you're briefing, what they care about, and what, as a result, you should include, right? So for me, if it's a member or a staffer, they do not want necessarily my thoughts on, some historical issue that for me is very interesting. But for them, they have limited time. They're going into a meeting. They don't want to be reading through all this stuff. So number 1, know your customer. 2, know what you're trying to deliver, right? So if it's a brief or something written, it could just be like, here's an update on the situation in X country, or it could be, here are your options, or it could be, here's how you should think about this issue, right? Try to, like, distill the issue or the point that you're trying to deliver. And then 3rd, structure, bottom line up front. We call it the bluff, bottom line up front. Don't make people wait for it. Just put it in the front. And I think when it comes to, like, writing and briefing, that skill, it takes in some cases a long time to hone. But if you can deliver your bottom line up front, it will pay dividends for how you do your job and how people view you. So that's the big, like, structural issue. Then on writing, space. So in college, I think a lot of people think about space as, like, something to fill up, something that we want to hit. Like, I remember kids at Davidson would, like, find all the periods in their paper and, like, make them, like, size 18 font, like if they were, like, short on a page limit, to, like, expand, and it's that sort of thing. Like, in college, I know that you have to, like, hit a page limit or something, or a page minimum. When it comes to the policy world, you have to think about space as, like the amount of pages or whatever in a memo. That's space that you need, right? So I am most consistently blown away by colleagues who can distill, like, a very complex thing down to, like, 1 or 2 sentences. And so really the page length is just the space that you need to convey an idea. And if you need a ton of space, probably either you don't understand that idea, or you have not devoted enough time to thinking about it. And absolutely, for me, when I'm, like, find myself writing on and on, it's because I have not done the work of, like, sitting down and saying, like, here's what actually matters, or here are the dynamics or trends that need to be in this memo. So, like, it's just a different mindset. In the policy world, if you're writing a lot, it just shows that, like, you haven't done the work to distill that stuff down. And as a result, you're making your reader do that work, and readers don't like to do that work. So that's the space thing. Number 3, just on the writing thing and on space, one just tip that I've loved to do, and I think that has made my writing much better, I learned this from a colleague at CRS, is to make your paragraphs flush with the end of the page. I don't mean if you have a little bit on the next line to add a bunch so you're flush. What I mean is find words that you can cut out to bring that one up, right? So whatever, if you have, like, a half a line, I'm sure that you can go back through the paragraph and find a couple adjectives that you can cut, or a couple words that could be shorter, maybe change a utilize to use. Just be simplistic and bring it, and I think it ends up looking better. And that process of finding stuff to delete, it makes your writing just more concise as well. So there's like two benefits to that. Make your conclusion your introduction, and make your introduction an outlook. Sorry. Make your conclusion your introduction, and make your conclusion an outlook. So everything, I remember writing at Davidson, I would like write a whole paper, and then through that process, I would finally figure out what I was trying to say, and then I would put that in the conclusion. When you're actually trying to like write and deliver like information, take what you would have put in the conclusion, make that your introduction, and then use your conclusion space to give an outlook on what's coming. So here's what the situation will likely look, will it get worse? Will it get better? Will it stay the same? What is the issue for Congress? What can Congress do about it? That can all go in like an outlook section, but the intro should not just be like some vibey thoughts at the beginning, and then it should be intentional, and it should be essentially like a, just a capturing what is to come. Finally, just pay attention to the footnotes. That is the biggest way, I think, to show that you are being intentional, that you are detail-oriented. For me, like when I was an intern, I would read the hell out of the footnotes. And if I can find if I'm reviewing someone's work and I find a typo, for them, that shows like, man, he's really into these footnotes. Like he's detail-oriented. And, for me, if I have, an intern or, someone I'm working with and they catch a footnote, again, I see them as like particularly detail-oriented, and I'm super appreciative because I'm like, wow, they are really reviewing this piece. So I just, I think I can't emphasize enough, like when you're asked, oftentimes as a, newer member of the office, you might be asked to like review or read through something, and go extra hard on the footnotes because other people won't be. Okay, and then just two things on briefing. Number one, I think I would just consider briefing as like a performance, right? And so you think about like seeing a presentation, there's, if I'm presenting, there's different characters that I can be. I can be, kind of more personable and a little bit jokey. I can be just like very kind of like straightforward, and one is not necessarily better or worse. I think you just need to be very like conscious of the image that you're projecting. So I have some colleagues who are just very straightforward, bland, no jokes, and they're just amazingly thorough and clear and to the point, and their message comes across. I have other colleagues who can do, they can convey the same information in the form of like a story, or they're kind of, being, I think, a bit more personal, not personable. I mean, you should always be nice, but like more of an exchange. And that works for them. And so like, there's no real like style of briefing that I think is better or worse. It's just like, I think just being conscious that you are, putting out a particular image, and just making sure you're being intentional about that. As a briefer, you can be effective. You don't need to like strive to some, perfectly clear, just like, straightforward, straight-laced, humorless presentation. I think you can be an effective briefer if you are able to find your voice. And then finally, just the last one, and I think this applies to writing too, it's just signposting. And so when you're talking with people, just keep in mind that like people don't listen to a presentation as if they are reading, that it's useful to say, 3 points, first, second, third, right? Or like one thing you want to consider is this. And it just gives like the person's brain a little bit of like, I was about to doze off, but now I'm going to pay attention, right? And I just remember, I was listening to a briefing and someone said, listen to this fact. And then he said the fact. And I did listen to the fact. And I was like, that's tremendous. He literally made me do that. But yeah, so it's just like, include some of these little, like, oftentimes you'll write out your briefing first and you'll write it as if it's a memo. But just keep in mind, like to build in like, first thing is, or, next we're going to talk about this. And so even it helps if people are taking notes and you're giving them just a little bit of a break to like put a number 2. Okay, next thing, don't just like flow into it. So anyway, those are my big 10. Sorry to be so long-winded, but I really enjoy talking about this. And I hope that some of these are like more applicable than just, be a good writer or read well, right? Which that's advice that I think I've gotten sometimes, and I just have not found all that useful. So
that was spectacular. I do think the be a good writer or talk to people, like short, kind of very difficult to utilize tidbits are given. So that was incredible. Thank you for breaking that down. And I think it applies broadly, even out of the policy field, just in general, to many careers. So thank you for that and for sharing your career. This was awesome.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I really appreciate it.